Blood pooling on the linoleum floor of Trauma Room 4 was just another Tuesday for most of the nursing staff. But for one woman hiding in plain sight, it was the beginning of a terrifying unraveling. Nobody at Cascade General Hospital knew about the classified combat missions, the extracted hostages in Kandahar, or the ghosts she left behind in the burning desert. She was merely a quiet, dependable trauma nurse, taking vital signs and charting medications. That is, until a critically wounded Navy SEAL was wheeled through the sliding glass doors, delirious with pain, and managed to grip her wrist, breathing a single, classified word that officially resurrected a woman who was supposed to be dead. Rebecca Lawson was a master of mediocrity. It was a skill she had honed, with the same meticulous, lethal precision she had once used to assemble an M4 carbine in total darkness. At 34 years old, her life in Seattle was a carefully constructed diorama of a deeply unremarkable existence. She drove a faded silver 2011 Honda Civic with a slight rattle in the muffler. She rented a sterile, one-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood, just boring enough to escape the attention of both criminals and gentrifiers. And she worked the graveyard shift at Cascade General Hospital, floating through the fluorescent-lit corridors like a shadow in blue scrubs. For 3 years, Rebecca had been the hospital's most dependable, yet entirely forgettable, trauma nurse. She never volunteered for leadership roles. She politely declined invitations to after-work drinks at the local pub with the other nurses. When charge nurse Brenda Gallagher asked for opinions on new triage protocols, Rebecca always deferred with a modest, "Whatever you think is best, Brenda." But beneath the unassuming posture and the plain, tortoiseshell glasses she wore to soften her sharp features, Rebecca was always watching. She observed the emergency room with the hypervigilance of a Tier 1 operator. She tracked the exits, cataloged the security blind spots, and read the body language of every patient who walked through the double doors. Her resting heart rate hovered at a cool 55 beats per minute, even when the ER descended into absolute chaos. It was a Tuesday at 2:14 a.m. when the fragile illusion of Rebecca's new life began to fracture. The emergency department was already drowning in the usual midweek madness. A multi-vehicle collision on Interstate 5 had filled 3 trauma bays with groaning patients, shattered glass, and the overwhelming copper scent of blood. Dr. Richard Allaby, the attending physician on shift, was a brilliant but high-strung surgeon who tended to shout when his stress levels spiked. "I need 2 units of O-negative stat, doctor," Allaby barked, hovering over a teenager with a crushed pelvis. "And where the hell is my central line kit?" Before Allaby had even finished the sentence, Rebecca stepped seamlessly into his peripheral vision, holding the sterile central line kit and the exact gauge of needle he preferred. She didn't say a word. She just placed it in his gloved hand. She had anticipated his need 3 full minutes before he realized it himself, reading the patient's crashing blood pressure on the monitor and assessing the immediate necessity of venous access. Allaby blinked, momentarily thrown by her silent efficiency. "Right, thank you, Lawson. Push 50 micrograms of fentanyl." "Already pushed, doctor," Rebecca replied, her voice soft, devoid of any inflection. Brenda Gallagher bustled past, wiping sweat from her forehead. "Good catch, Becky. You always manage to keep your cool. I don't know how you do it." Rebecca offered a practiced, sheepish smile. "Just trying to help, Brenda." She turned away, discarding blood-soaked gauze into a biohazard bin. The truth was, this wasn't chaos to her. Chaos was a medevac helicopter, taking RPG fire over the Hindu Kush, while she performed an emergency cricothyrotomy on a bleeding ranger in pitch darkness. A crowded civilian emergency room in the Pacific Northwest was practically a vacation. But the ghosts of her past were never far away. As she washed her hands, staring blindly at the soap suds spiraling down the stainless steel drain, a phantom memory flickered in her mind. The smell of cordite, the deafening roar of a breached compound, the frantic, garbled screams coming over the encrypted comms channel, Operation Crimson Dawn, the mission that had gone spectacularly, fatally wrong. The mission where Rebecca Lawson had officially ceased to exist, replaced by a fabricated casualty report and a closed-casket funeral back in Arlington. She gripped the edges of the sink until her knuckles turned white, forcing the memories back into the steel vault in her mind. She closed her eyes, breathing in the sterile scent of the hospital. "You are Rebecca Lawson," she reminded herself. "You are just a nurse." Suddenly, the red emergency phone on Brenda's desk began to ring. It wasn't the standard ringtone for incoming ambulances. It was the high-pitched, piercing trill reserved for critical, incoming life flights. Brenda snatched the receiver. Her face, usually a mask of weary annoyance, drained of all color. "Understood. We are clearing Trauma Room 1. ETA?" She looked up at the digital clock on the wall. 3 minutes. We'll be ready." Brenda slammed the phone down and clapped her hands, her voice echoing over the groans of the ER. "Listen up, everyone. We have a priority one incoming. Coast Guard Jayhawk landing on the roof in 3 minutes. Massive trauma." "Doctor." Allaby stripped off his bloody gloves and grabbed a fresh pair. "What's the story, Brenda? Fishing boat accident?" "No," Brenda said, her voice dropping to a hushed, nervous register. "Federal transport. I was told to clear the bay of all non-essential personnel. We're getting an escort of federal agents down here in 2 minutes. The patient is active duty military. Navy SEAL. Found unresponsive in a vehicle rollover off Highway 101. But they mentioned penetrating trauma, gunshot wounds." The air in the room seemed to shift. Gunshot wounds in a vehicle rollover involving a SEAL on a civilian highway? Rebecca's instincts, dormant for 3 years, violently kicked awake. The hairs on her arms stood up. That wasn't an accident. That was a hit. "Lawson," Dr. Allaby called out, snapping her out of her thoughts. "I need you in Trauma 1. You're the best I've got under pressure. Let's move." Rebecca hesitated for a fraction of a second. She should step back. She should let another nurse take the lead. Getting involved in a high-profile military case was a direct threat to her cover. But the ingrained duty of a combat medic overpowered her survival instincts. "On my way," she said quietly, following the surgeon toward the double doors. The distinctive, heavy thwack 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 of the UH-60 Blackhawk, not a Coast Guard Jayhawk, Rebecca immediately noted with grim realization, vibrated through the concrete ceiling of the hospital. A Coast Guard chopper sounded different. This was military hardware, heavily modified, Joint Special Operations Command. Why was JSOC flying a wounded man directly into a civilian hospital in Seattle? Before she could process the implications, the sliding doors to the ambulance bay blew open. A team of paramedics rushed in, pushing a gurney that was slick with fresh blood. But it wasn't just paramedics. Flanking the gurney were 4 men in dark tactical gear, carrying concealed but obvious sidearms under their windbreakers. They moved with the aggressive, sweeping motions of close protection details. One of them, a tall man with a severe buzz cut and an earpiece, shoved a hospital orderly out of the way. "Clear the corridor. Move," the agent bellowed, flashing a badge that Rebecca instantly recognized as Department of Defense. "Bring him here. Trauma 1. "Doctor," Allaby shouted, waving the chaotic entourage into the largest resuscitation bay. The gurney slammed against the bed rails, and they transferred the patient on Dr. Allaby's count. Rebecca stepped up to the opposite side of the bed, her hands automatically grabbing a pair of trauma shears to cut away the patient's clothing. As she ripped the heavy, blood-soaked flannel shirt open, her breath caught in her throat. The man on the table was a roadmap of violence. He was broad-shouldered and heavily muscled, but his pale skin was covered in a network of faded scars, shrapnel marks, old knife wounds, the undeniable tapestry of a career spent in the darkest corners of the world. On his left pectoral muscle, partially obscured by a massive, fresh laceration, was the tattoo of the Navy SEAL trident. But it was the tattoo on his right forearm that made Rebecca's blood run cold. A stylized skull pierced by a single jagged lightning bolt. Task Force 88, her old unit. "GCS is 6, a paramedic shouted, rattling off the Glasgow coma scale. "Heart rate is pushing 140. BP is 80/40 and dropping. He took 2 rounds to the right flank, 1 to the upper shoulder, and was trapped in the vehicle for 20 minutes. He's hypovolemic, Dr. Allaby said, his voice tight with panic. Lawson, get 2 large bore force in him now. I need uncross-matched blood hanging stat. Rebecca didn't speak. She moved with a speed that defied the naked eye. While the other nurses fumbled with the sheer volume of blood and the intimidating presence of the armed federal agents standing in the corners of the room, Rebecca found a vein in the man's battered arm and slid a 1/4-gauge needle in flawlessly. She hooked up the rapid infuser, pushing units of O-negative blood into his system to keep his heart from failing. Who is he? Brenda asked nervously, looking at the DOD agent in charge. His name is not your concern, the agent snapped. Just keep him alive. Rebecca focused on the patient's face. It was bruised, covered in soot and dried blood, but as she wiped a wet sponge across his forehead, his features became clear. He had a strong jaw, a broken nose that had healed badly in the past, and a faint, crescent-shaped scar above his left eyebrow. Rebecca's hands stopped. The sterile sponge hovered an inch above his skin. She knew him. It was Lieutenant Commander David Collins. They had served together in Helmand. He had provided sniper overwatch, while she dragged a wounded interpreter out of a kill zone under heavy machine gun fire. He was one of the few men alive who knew the true identity of the woman behind her classified call sign. He thinks I'm dead, Rebecca thought, a wave of vertigo washing over her. The whole world thinks I'm dead. If he opens his eyes... Pressure is dropping, Brenda yelled, pointing at the monitor as the alarm screamed. 60/30. He's crashing. He's got a tension pneumothorax, Rebecca said abruptly, her voice cutting through the panic with absolute authority. She didn't sound like a timid civilian nurse anymore. She sounded like a commanding officer. He needs needle decompression on the right side, right now, or his heart is going to stop. Dr. Allaby looked at her, startled by her tone. He glanced at the patient's chest. I don't see tracheal deviation, Lawson. We need an X-ray. There's no time for an X-ray. His right lung has collapsed and is compressing the vena cava. Rebecca snapped, abandoning her cover entirely. She grabbed a 1/4-gauge angiocatheter from the tray. If you don't do it, I will. The lead DOD agent narrowed his eyes, stepping forward, his hand resting on his weapon. Who the hell are you? Before anyone could stop her, Rebecca located the second intercostal space on David's right chest. She plunged the needle in. A loud, audible hiss of trapped air escaped the chest cavity. Almost instantly, the harsh, erratic beeping of the cardiac monitor began to stabilize. The blood pressure numbers on the screen slowly ticked upward. Dr. Allaby stared at her, utterly bewildered. How did you know that without imaging? Rebecca took a deep breath, instantly regretting her outburst. She lowered her head, letting the timid nurse persona wash back over her like a heavy cloak. I saw something similar during my clinical rotations, doctor. I'm sorry. I just panicked. She felt the heavy, suspicious gaze of the lead agent burning into the side of her head. He was watching her every move now. Let's get a chest tube in him, doctor, Allaby ordered, shaking off his shock. And prep him for the OR. We need to find the source of the bleeding in his abdomen. For the next hour, Rebecca kept her head down, operating silently and efficiently, desperate to blend back into the background. She helped stabilize David, wrapping his wounds, managing his airways, and prepping him for the surgical team. She avoided looking at his face, terrified that he might wake up. As they wheeled him out of the trauma bay and toward the surgical elevators, the lead agent grabbed Dr. Allaby's shoulder. You save him, Doc, the agent said coldly. He's the only one who saw the shooter's face. National security depends on this man waking up. Rebecca stood by the empty, blood-stained bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. A shooter. A targeted hit on a Navy SEAL on American soil. If David woke up, he would talk to the agents. And if he saw her, everything she had built, her entire survival, would be destroyed in an instant. By 6:00 a.m., the emergency room had settled into a sullen, exhausted quiet. The sun had not yet risen. leaving Seattle wrapped in a suffocating blanket of gray fog. Rebecca sat at the nurse's station, staring blankly at a computer screen, pretending to update patient charts. In reality, her mind was racing through a dozen contingency plans. She mentally calculated the time it would take to drive back to her apartment, grab her pre-packed go bag containing a fake passport, $50,000 in untraceable cash, and a Glock 19, and disappear into the Canadian wilderness before the DOD could run her fingerprints. I have to leave, she thought. I have to leave right now. Lawson, Brenda called out softly, breaking her train of thought. Rebecca flinched internally, but turned around with a polite, tired smile. Yes, Brenda? Dr. Allaby wants you up in the surgical intensive care unit, Brenda said, handing her a clipboard. Our VIP patient made it through surgery. They removed 2 bullets and repaired a lacerated liver. He's critical, but stable. They requested a dedicated trauma nurse to monitor him one-on-one for the next 12 hours. Allaby specifically asked for you. He said you have a good instinct for this sort of thing. Rebecca's stomach plummeted. Brenda, I've been on my feet for 10 hours. Surely someone else. I know it's a lot to ask, Becky, Brenda interrupted, her tone sympathetic but firm. But the guys in suits up there are terrifying the regular ICU staff. They trust you. Just sit with him until the day shift comes in at 8:00 a.m. Overtime pay, I promise. There was no way out without raising suspicion. A refusal would look bizarre to Brenda, and if she suddenly walked off her shift, the federal agents would definitely notice. Okay, Rebecca said quietly, taking the clipboard. I'll head up. The SICU was a heavily fortified fortress on the 4th floor. When Rebecca stepped off the elevator, she was immediately stopped by 2 armed men in suits. They patted her down, checked her hospital ID badge, and scanned her face with cold, calculating eyes. Room 412, one of them muttered, stepping aside. Do not speak to the patient if he wakes up. You speak to Agent Higgins. He's inside. Rebecca nodded mutely and walked down the quiet, dimly lit corridor. The rhythmic whoosh-click of mechanical ventilators was the only sound. She pushed open the heavy glass door to room 412. The room was dark, illuminated only by the glow of the medical monitors. David Collins lay in the center of the room, looking impossibly small amidst the tangle of wires, IV lines, and the thick plastic tube snaking down his throat. Sitting in a chair in the corner of the room was Agent Bradley Higgins. He was the man from the trauma bay who had questioned her intervention. He was awake, alert, and sipping black coffee from a styrofoam cup. Nurse Lawson, Higgins said, reading her name tag. His voice was a low, gravelly drawl. You did good work down there. Impressive for a civilian. Thank you, Rebecca said softly, keeping her eyes averted as she walked to the bedside. She began checking the IV drips propofol for sedation, norepinephrine to keep his blood pressure up. Where did you do your training? Higgins asked casually. Too casually. It was an interrogation disguised as small talk. Just local, Rebecca lied smoothly. University of Washington. I've been an ER nurse for a few years. You see a lot of trauma. Higgins didn't reply immediately. He took a slow sip of his coffee. Right, just a local girl. Rebecca ignored him, focusing on David. She checked his pupils with a penlight. They were sluggish, but reacting. The heavy doses of propofol were keeping him under, but his body was fighting it. The rugged features of the man she once knew were slack, but even in a coma, David possessed an aura of dangerous resilience. She remembered the last time she had seen him. It was the night Operation Crimson Dawn imploded. A CIA black site in the Helmand Desert had been compromised. They were pinned down by an overwhelming force of insurgents. Rebecca, acting under her classified call sign, had been ordering the evacuation while returning fire. David had been on the roof, laying down cover. When the mortar hit the building, the roof collapsed. Rebecca had been trapped under the rubble. The official report stated she had burned to death. Only she hadn't. She had crawled out of the ashes, realizing that the ambush was an inside job. Someone high up in the intelligence community had sold them out. To stay alive, she had to stay dead. Suddenly, the cardiac monitor hitched. The heart rate spiked from 80 to 120 inches a matter of seconds. David's body went rigid. His eyes flew open, wildly dilated and filled with raw, unadulterated panic. The alarms on the machines began to shriek as he instinctively reached up, his massive, bruised hand grabbing the endotracheal tube in his mouth, trying to rip it out. "He's waking up. He's fighting the vent," Rebecca yelled, snapping into action. She dropped her clipboard and lunged forward, grabbing David's wrists to pin them to the bed. "Commander, do not pull the tube. You're in a hospital." Agent Higgins bolted upright from his chair, reaching for his radio. "We need a doctor in here. He's awake." David thrashed violently, displaying terrifying strength despite the massive trauma he had just endured. It took all of Rebecca's leverage to keep his hands away from his throat. "David, stop!" she hissed, the name slipping out before she could stop herself. David froze. The wild, unfocused panic in his eyes suddenly sharpened. He stopped fighting the ventilator. He stared up at the nurse, pinning his arms down. He looked at her plain tortoiseshell glasses, her generic haircut, her unremarkable scrubs. But then he looked deeper. He looked at the grip she had on his wrists, a specific tactical restraint hold designed to immobilize without causing further injury. He looked into her eyes. The silence in the room stretched out, agonizing and thick, broken only by the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator breathing for him. David's hands slowly relaxed. Instead of fighting her, he turned his hand over, his thick fingers wrapping weakly but deliberately around her wrist. Agent Higgins rushed to the opposite side of the bed. "Commander Collins, can you hear me? We need to know who hit the convoy." David ignored the federal agent completely. He didn't even turn his head. His bloodshot eyes were locked entirely on Rebecca. He couldn't speak around the plastic tube in his airway, but he didn't need to. With excruciating effort, David pulled Rebecca's wrist closer to his face. His lips moved awkwardly around the tube, mouthing a word with such intensity that Rebecca felt it echo in her bones. He mouthed it twice to ensure she understood. "Kestrel." Rebecca's blood turned to ice. She stared down at the man who was supposed to believe she was a pile of ashes in Afghanistan. He squeezed her wrist one final time, his eyes boring into hers with desperate urgency, before he mouthed 3 more words. "They found you." Before Rebecca could react, the heavy sedatives flooded back into his system. David's eyes rolled back, his grip slackened, and he slipped back into the dark void of the coma. Rebecca stood frozen over the bed, the alarms still blinking around her. Behind her, Agent Higgins was speaking rapidly into his radio, entirely oblivious to the silent exchange that had just occurred. The ghost of Rebecca Lawson had just been dragged out of the grave, and the people who put her there were coming to finish the job. The rhythmic, mechanical sigh of the ventilator was the only sound, masking the deafening roar of panic inside Rebecca's mind. She stepped back from David's bed, her face a carefully constructed mask of clinical detachment, even as the adrenaline threatened to shake her hands. Agent Bradley Higgins stepped away from the window, his radio clutched in his fist. He stared at her, his eyes narrowed into 2 suspicious slits. "What did he say to you?" "He didn't say anything, Agent Higgins," Rebecca replied smoothly, her voice hitting the perfect pitch of a slightly rattled but professional nurse. "He's intubated. He was choking on the endotracheal tube and experiencing emergence delirium. It's a common reaction when sedation levels fluctuate." Higgins didn't look convinced. He walked over to the bed, looking down at David's unconscious form, and then back at Rebecca. "He grabbed your wrist. He looked right at you. I saw his lips moving." "Patients in a state of delirium often fixate on the closest person," Rebecca said, adjusting the IV lines to give her hands something to do. "He was likely hallucinating. If he had managed to pull that tube out, his airway would have collapsed. I did what I had to do." Higgins was silent for a long moment. He leaned closer, invading her personal space, trying to provoke a physical reaction. Rebecca kept her breathing even, her heart rate steady. She was Kestrel. She had beaten polygraph tests, administered by the CIA's most paranoid interrogators. A DOD agent with a caffeine addiction was not going to break her cover. "We'll see," Higgins muttered, finally stepping back. "The day shift is arriving in 30 minutes. You're relieved, Lawson. Go home." "Thank you," she said softly. She gathered her discarded clipboard, gave David one last lingering look, and walked out of room 412. The moment the heavy glass door clicked shut behind her, the timid nurse persona vanished. Her posture straightened, the slight slouch disappearing, replaced by a fluid, predatory grace. She walked past the two armed agents, stationed at the elevator bank, offering them a polite, exhausted nod, and stepped into the descending car. As the doors closed, she hit the button for the basement level. "They found you." David's warning echoed in her ears like a physical blow. If the people who had orchestrated the ambush in Helmand knew she was alive, it meant the entire hospital was a kill box. Operation Crimson Dawn hadn't been a botched mission. It had been an execution. Her team had uncovered a massive black market weapons syndicate operating out of Bagram, funneling advanced American tactical gear to hostile insurgents. And the man profiting from it wasn't a warlord, it was Deputy Director Arthur Sterling, a high-ranking intelligence officer at the Pentagon. Sterling had ordered the strike on their position to tie up loose ends. David had miraculously survived, and clearly spent the last 3 years digging for the truth, only to get shot on a rainy highway in Seattle. And somehow, Sterling's men had tracked the breadcrumbs right to Cascade General Hospital. The elevator dinged, opening into the sterile, fluorescent-lit basement corridor. Rebecca moved quickly toward the women's locker room. She needed to vanish. Her emergency protocols dictated immediate extraction. She keyed in the code to the locker room door, slipping inside the empty, echoing space. She went straight to locker 42, spinning the combination dial with lightning speed. Inside hung her spare scrubs and a worn denim jacket. She reached beneath the metal base plate of the locker, her fingers finding the magnetic lockbox hidden in the false bottom. Pulling it out, she opened it to reveal the tools of a ghost: a burner smartphone, a forged Canadian passport under the name Valerie Reed, 2 stacks of $100 bills, and a custom non-metallic ceramic combat knife that could pass through hospital metal detectors. She slipped the knife into the deep pocket of her scrub pants and powered on the burner phone. She needed to walk out the loading dock doors, steal a vehicle, and cross the border before the sun fully breached the horizon. It was the only logical play. Kestrel was an operator. Operators survived. But as she slung her backpack over her shoulder and turned toward the door, she stopped. She saw David's bruised, desperate face. She felt the weak grip of his massive hand on her wrist. "He came here for me," she realized with a sickening jolt of clarity. The vehicle rollover off Highway 101. He hadn't been ambushed randomly. He was trying to reach Seattle. He was trying to reach her. If she walked out that door, Higgins and his men would be sitting ducks. Sterling's hit squad wouldn't just kill David. They would slaughter anyone in the Siku who got in their way. Rebecca closed her eyes, cursing herself in 3 different languages. Survival was the first rule of her training, but loyalty was the only reason she had ever enlisted. She shoved the passport and the cash back into the locker, keeping only the ceramic blade. She wasn't leaving. She was going to work. Rebecca left the locker room and jogged silently down the basement corridor to the hospital's security nerve center. The door was propped open, and the lone night shift security guard, an elderly man named Frank, was dozing in his chair, a half-eaten donut resting on a napkin beside him. Moving like a shadow, Rebecca slipped behind him and glanced at the bank of CCTV monitors displaying the hospital's entrances. Her eyes immediately locked onto camera feed 04, the east entrance. 3 men were walking through the sliding glass doors. They were dressed in dark paramedic uniforms, carrying large black medical trauma bags. But their movements were entirely wrong for civilian medical personnel. They moved in a tactical diamond formation. Their eyes were scanning the ceiling corners for cameras, not looking for the triage desk. And the weight of their trauma bags pulled heavily on the shoulder straps, too heavy for gauze and saline. Those bags were holding suppressed submachine guns. 3 hostiles, heavily armed, moving with purpose. Rebecca checked the timestamp. They had just entered. It would take them exactly 2 minutes to reach the service elevators and another minute to reach the 4th floor. She slipped out of the security room, leaving Frank undisturbed, and sprinted for the stairwell. Taking the concrete steps 3 at a time, her mind calculated the odds, the angles, and the available weaponry. She had no firearm. She had a ceramic knife, a hospital full of civilians, and 3 heavily armed professional killers marching toward the man she had to protect. It was time to turn the hospital into a weapon. Rebecca burst through the heavy fire doors onto the 4th floor, her breathing completely controlled despite the sprint. She was no longer Kestrel the ghost. She was Kestrel, the apex predator. The SICU corridor was quiet. The 2 real DoD agents were still standing by the main elevators, holding awful, weak hospital coffee, completely unaware that death was riding the service elevator up to their floor. She didn't have time to warn them without causing a panic that would get innocent nurses killed. She needed a choke point. Rebecca slipped into the medication prep room, located exactly halfway between the service elevators and David's room. She quickly logged into the Pyxis med station with her fingerprint. The machine hummed to life. Come on, she whispered, her fingers flying across the touchscreen. She overrode the standard dispensing protocols using an emergency code she had memorized during her first week. A drawer popped open. She grabbed 3 vials of succinylcholine, a powerful, fast-acting paralytic used for emergency intubations. In small doses, it relaxed the vocal cords. In massive, unmeasured doses, injected directly into the bloodstream, it caused complete muscular paralysis, including the diaphragm, resulting in suffocation within minutes. She drew the clear liquid into 3 large-gauge syringes, capping them and slipping them into her scrub pockets alongside the ceramic blade. She grabbed a heavy metal oxygen cylinder from the corner, hefting its weight, and positioned herself behind the solid wooden door of the medroom, leaving it cracked open just an inch. Ding! The soft chime of the service elevator echoed down the hall. Through the crack in the door, Rebecca watched the 3 men step out. They had unzipped their medical bags. 2 of them had drawn suppressed MP7 submachine guns, keeping them tight against their sides, hidden by their bodies from anyone down the hall. The lead man, a towering figure with a jagged scar across his jawline, raised a hand, signaling the others to halt. They moved with chilling silence. The leader pointed 2 fingers at the DoD agents guarding the main elevator down the hall, then made a swift, slicing motion across his throat. The 2 trailing assassins moved forward. The DoD agents never stood a chance. The pff, pff of the suppressed weapons sounded like nothing more than a heavy stapler being used. Both agents crumpled to the linoleum floor instantly, shot cleanly through the head before they could even reach for their sidearms. Inside the medroom, Rebecca's jaw tightened. These were elite contractors. Black Ops. Sterling had sent his best. The leader stepped over the bodies of the DoD agents and gestured toward room 412. But as they advanced, the trailing assassin paused, glancing at the partially open door of the medication room. He tapped the leader on the shoulder, pointing at the room to indicate he was going to clear it. The leader nodded, continuing down the hall toward David. The 3rd assassin pushed the medroom door open with the barrel of his MP7, stepping into the dim light. He never even saw Kestrel move. Rebecca struck from the blind spot behind the door. She didn't use the knife. It was too messy, and blood would alert the others. Instead, she swung the heavy metal oxygen cylinder in a brutal, compact arc, bringing it down squarely on the back of the man's neck. There was a sickening crack. The assassin's nervous system short-circuited instantly. Before his heavy body could hit the floor and make a sound, Rebecca caught him beneath the armpits, lowering him silently to the tiles. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed his dropped MP7, checking the chamber, but discarded it beneath the counter. A suppressed weapon firing inside the quiet SICU would still make enough noise to alert Higgins, potentially causing him to fire blindly and hit David. She needed silent kills. She peered out the door. The leader and the second assassin had reached the heavy glass doors of room 412. Inside, Agent Higgins was sitting in his chair, reading a file. He had his back to the door. The second assassin raised his weapon, aiming right through the glass at the back of Higgins's head. Rebecca knew she couldn't reach them in time. She needed a distraction, and she needed it instantly. She pulled a fire alarm lever located inside the medroom, immediately followed by smashing a glass beaker of iodine against the floor. The deafening, shrieking wail of the hospital's emergency sirens instantly shattered the silence. Strobe lights began flashing violently in the corridor. The sudden, piercing noise startled the assassin at the glass door. His shot went wide, the suppressed round shattering the thick glass of room 412 instead of hitting Higgins's skull. Higgins, to his credit, was a seasoned veteran. He didn't freeze. At the sound of shattering glass, he threw himself backward out of his chair, drawing his Glock 19 from his shoulder holster as he hit the floor, overturning a metal tray table for cover. "Contact!" Higgins roared, firing blindly through the shattered door frame. His loud, unsuppressed gunshots boomed like cannon fire, adding to the absolute chaos of the shrieking alarms. The two assassins immediately took cover on either side of the doorway, returning fire. Bullets chewed through the drywall and destroyed the medical monitors in David's room. This was Rebecca's window. She slipped out of the medroom, dropping into a low crouch, moving under the strobe lights like a phantom. The flashing lights disoriented the assassins, ruining their night vision. She approached the second assassin from behind as he was reloading his weapon. She didn't use the cylinder this time. She moved in tight, grabbing the back of his tactical vest with her left hand, violently yanking him backward off balance. As he stumbled, she drove her right hand forward, plunging the syringe full of succinylcholine directly into his carotid artery, depressing the plunger with her thumb in a fraction of a second. The man gasped, thrashing wildly, his hands dropping his weapon to claw at his neck. But within 3 seconds, his eyes rolled back in terror. The paralytic froze his muscles. He collapsed to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut, entirely conscious but unable to move or breathe. The leader, hearing the scuffle, whipped around. He saw Rebecca standing over his dying partner, the strobe light illuminating her face. The man's eyes widened in genuine shock. He lowered his weapon slightly. "Kestrel," he breathed, the name barely audible over the sirens. "Sterling said you were dead." "Sterling was wrong," Rebecca said, her voice ice cold. The assassin raised his MP7 to fire, but Rebecca was already moving. She kicked the dropped weapon of the paralyzed man, sending it skidding across the floor, and lunged. The leader fired a 3-round burst. One bullet grazed the shoulder of Rebecca's scrubs, burning like a hot iron, but she didn't flinch. She closed the distance, deflecting the barrel of his gun upward with her left forearm, while driving the ceramic blade deep into the soft tissue of his inner thigh, expertly severing the femoral artery. The man screamed, a wet gargling sound, dropping his gun to clutch at his leg as blood jetted out in a massive, pulsing spray. He staggered backward, hitting the wall, sliding down into a rapidly expanding pool of his own blood. Rebecca stood over him, breathing heavily, the sirens wailing around them. She looked down at the assassin, her face completely devoid of mercy. "Tell Sterling," she whispered, leaning in close so only he could hear, "that dead women don't leave witnesses." The man's eyes glazed over as the catastrophic blood loss took him. Rebecca spun around, her heart hammering. The corridor was secured, but the chaos was far from over. Inside room 412, the gunfire had stopped. "Higgins!" Rebecca shouted, keeping her hands visible as she stepped into the shattered doorway. "Do not shoot. It's Lawson. The hostiles are down." Through the smoke and the flashing red strobe lights, Higgins slowly rose from behind the overturned table. His face was pale, his suit covered in drywall dust, his weapon still raised and pointed directly at her chest. He looked at the carnage in the hallway, 3 dead or dying men in tactical gear, neutralized in less than 60 seconds. Then he looked at the quiet, unassuming trauma nurse standing in the doorway, blood on her scrubs and a ceramic combat knife in her hand. "Who the hell are you?" Higgins rasped, his hands shaking slightly. Rebecca glanced at David's bed. Miraculously, he hadn't been hit by the crossfire. The ventilator was still pumping air into his lungs. She looked back at Higgins, dropping the ceramic blade to the floor. She slowly raised her hands. "My name is Rebecca Lawson," she said, her voice steady and commanding, stripping away the last remnants of the timid nurse. "And we have approximately 5 minutes to evacuate Commander Collins before the people who sent them realize they failed." The shrieking fire alarms of Cascade General Hospital created a deafening, disorienting soundscape, masking the rapid exchange between the nurse and the federal agent. Higgins did not lower his weapon immediately. His training dictated that he shoot the unknown variable, but his survival instinct, staring at the trail of slaughtered elite operatives behind this woman, told him to listen. "Lawson?" Higgins repeated, his voice cracking from the drywall dust, coating his throat. "You just dismantled a 3-man wet work team in under a minute with a stolen syringe and a ceramic blade. You are not a registered nurse." "My name is Rebecca," she said, stepping fully into the room, her eyes rapidly scanning the destroyed medical equipment. The wall-mounted ventilator had been shattered by a stray bullet, its digital screen sparking. "But the men who just tried to kill you know me as Kestrel. And if we don't get Commander Collins out of this building in the next 3 minutes, Arthur Sterling is going to send a secondary cleaner team dressed as Seattle PD to finish the job." Higgins's eyes widened at the mention of the Pentagon deputy director. He finally lowered his Glock, holstering it with a sharp, decisive click. "Sterling. He's the leak." Collins suspected a high-level compromise regarding the Helmand weapons syndicate, but we didn't have a name. "You have it now. Hand me that ambu bag from the crash cart," Rebecca ordered, seamlessly transitioning back into a trauma medic. The electronic ventilator was failing, unable to maintain the necessary positive end expiratory pressure. David's chest was barely rising. Rebecca disconnected the heavy plastic tubing from the wall unit and attached a green, manual resuscitation bag directly to his endotracheal tube. She squeezed the bag with a rhythmic measured cadence, manually forcing oxygen into his battered lungs. "I can't push a gurney, bag a patient, and shoot our way out of here," Rebecca said, tossing her stolen burner phone and an extra magazine from one of the dead assassins to Higgins. "You take point. We use the service elevator to access the basement loading docks. There are 4 hospital ambulances, parked in Bay C. We take Unit 7. I know the mechanic leaves the keys in the sun visor." Higgins grabbed the foot of the heavy ICU bed, unlocking the casters. "And what makes you think the basement is clear?" "Because professionals sweep from the top down," Rebecca replied coldly. "Move." They burst out of room 412, the bed wheels rattling violently over the shattered glass and discarded brass casings littering the corridor. Higgins kept his weapon raised, stepping over the neutralized assassins with a grimace. The descent in the service elevator was agonizingly slow. The mechanical hum of the car seemed entirely too loud, and the flashing emergency lights painted the metal walls in harsh, bloody crimson. Rebecca stood by David's head, her hands working the ambu bag with machine-like precision, keeping his oxygen saturation levels from plummeting into cardiac arrest. She watched his bruised, pale face, praying that his heart could withstand the sheer physiological stress of the movement. "Where are we taking him?" Higgins asked, his eyes locked on the digital floor indicator counting down. "JSOC headquarters? The local FBI field office?" "Neither. Sterling has assets in every federal alphabet agency. The moment you transmit a secure location, a drone strike will level the building," Rebecca stated, adjusting the IV drip of norepinephrine with her free hand. "I know a decommissioned naval warehouse in Bremerton. It's off the grid, lined with lead, and I have a sterile surgical suite set up there from my previous life. We take him there." The elevator chimed, opening into the cavernous, dimly lit hospital basement. The air smelled of industrial bleach and wet concrete. Higgins stepped out first, slicing the pie around the corner, his weapon tracking every shadow. "Clear," he whispered. They pushed the bed down the long, echoing corridor toward the loading docks. The heavy steel roll-up doors were closed, but through the glass panes of the pedestrian exit, they could see the torrential Seattle rain lashing against the concrete. Just as they reached the final intersection, a man in a rain-slicked Seattle Police Department uniform stepped out from behind a stack of linen carts. He had a heavy-duty shotgun raised, but his eyes lacked the frantic, reactive energy of a first responder. His gaze was cold, calculated, and fixed entirely on David's bed. "Police! Drop the weapons!" the man barked, racking the shotgun. Higgins didn't hesitate. He recognized the tactical stance of a private military contractor immediately. The agent fired twice, a double tap directly into the center mass of the fake officer's Kevlar vest, followed immediately by a third round to the bridge of the nose. The man collapsed backward into the linen carts without firing a shot. Unit 7. Rebecca yelled over the ringing in their ears, kicking open the pedestrian door. "Let's go." The freezing rain hit them like a wall. Higgins scrambled to the driver's side of the designated ambulance, tearing open the door and ripping the keys from the sun visor, while Rebecca expertly collapsed the ICU bed's undercarriage. Together, they shoved the heavy gurney into the back of the rig. The ambulance engine roared to life, the tires screeching against the wet asphalt as Higgins threw it into reverse, smashing through the wooden security arm of the loading dock and tearing out into the chaotic, siren-filled streets of Seattle. The back of the ambulance was a violent, swaying nightmare. Rebecca braced her boots against the metal cabinets, refusing to lose her rhythm on the ambu bag, as Higgins navigated the treacherous, rain-slicked curves of Interstate 5. Every pothole threatened to dislodge David's chest tube. Every sharp turn threatened to rip the IV lines from his arms. "We have police cruisers converging on the hospital behind us," Higgins shouted through the open partition. "I'm taking the back roads toward the Bremerton ferry docks." "Keep us off the main cameras," Rebecca shouted back. She looked down at David. The violent motion of the ambulance was causing his sedation levels to wane. His eyelids fluttered, groggy and unfocused, fighting through the heavy chemical fog. Slowly, painfully, his eyes opened. He stared at the ceiling of the ambulance, the red and white lights flashing through the back windows, before his gaze locked onto the woman leaning over him. Rebecca didn't stop bagging his lungs, but she offered a tight ghost of a smile. David's hand, heavy and bruised, slid across the sterile sheets until his fingers brushed against hers. He couldn't speak around the plastic tube, but the profound relief in his eyes spoke volumes. He had driven into a trap, taken 2 bullets to the chest, and crawled through hell just to find her, and he had. "I'm here, Commander," Rebecca whispered softly, the cold, tactical edge of her voice melting away for a fraction of a second. "I've got you. Kestrel is on station." David squeezed her fingers weakly, his eyes communicating a silent, solemn vow. They were back in the fight. An hour later, the ambulance pulled into the rusted, corrugated steel doors of the abandoned Bremerton shipyard warehouse. Higgins threw the vehicle into park, immediately stepping to the rear to help unload. The interior of the warehouse was dark, save for a brilliantly lit, hyper-sterile surgical bay constructed out of thick plastic sheeting in the center of the room. It was Kestrel's sanctuary, a fully functional black market trauma center she had built with the millions in untraceable cash she had siphoned from Sterling's illicit accounts before faking her death. They transferred David onto the stationary surgical table. Rebecca quickly connected him to a functional, military-grade portable ventilator, finally freeing her hands from the manual resuscitation bag. "He's stable," Rebecca announced, checking the monitors. She looked at Higgins, who was leaning heavily against a metal beam, clutching his ribs where a stray bullet had grazed his Kevlar vest during the hospital shootout. Rebecca walked over to a metal footlocker in the corner of the room. She entered a combination, popped the latches, and pulled out a heavy, tactical duffel bag. She began loading it with spare magazines, a suppressed Sig Sauer MCX rifle, encrypted satellite comms, and a stack of forged passports. Higgins watched her, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What are you doing?" "We need to establish a perimeter. We need to contact Loyalist assets within the DoD." "You are going to contact your Loyalist assets, Higgins." I've written down a secure frequency on the notepad by the sink. It connects directly to Admiral Vance at the Pentagon. He's clean, Rebecca said, slinging the heavy duffel bag over her shoulder and zipping up a black tactical jacket over her blood-stained scrubs. Wait, Higgins stammered, stepping forward. Where the hell are you going? Rebecca paused by the exit, looking back at the sterile bay. David was unconscious again, his chest rising and falling steadily with the mechanical breaths of the ventilator. He was safe. He had brought the war to her doorstep, but now it was time to finish it. Arthur Sterling thinks he can orchestrate hits on American soil. He thinks he buried me in the sand in Helmand, Rebecca said, her voice dropping to a lethal, icy whisper. He's about to find out that some ghosts don't stay in the ground. Without another word, Kestrel turned and disappeared into the rainy Seattle night. 3,000 miles away, in the secure, soundproofed basement office of the Pentagon, Deputy Director Arthur Sterling poured himself a glass of expensive scotch. He checked his encrypted phone, waiting for the confirmation text from his Seattle strike team. Instead, the phone buzzed with an incoming message from an unknown, untraceable international number. Sterling frowned, opening the text. There was no message. There was only a single, high-resolution photograph. It was a picture of the charred, supposedly destroyed dog tags belonging to Kestrel, resting neatly on the desk of his own private residence in Virginia. Sterling's glass shattered on the floor, the amber liquid pooling like blood. If your heart is still pounding from this real-life military medical thriller, you are not alone. The courage it takes to hide in plain sight, only to step back into the line of fire to save a brother in arms, is the ultimate definition of loyalty. Kestrel's transition from a quiet trauma nurse to a tactical operator is a breathtaking reminder that heroes walk among us, often carrying secrets we could never begin to understand. Who do you think would win the final showdown between Kestrel and the corrupt deputy director? Drop your predictions in the comments below. If you love stories of intense survival, military espionage, and unbreakable bonds, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this video with your friends who love a massive plot twist, and subscribe to our channel for more explosive, real-life drama stories.